I'm gonna welcome people again by saying hello. So in the name of the Commons Engine, Sherry Herndon and I are gonna be co-facilitating this session today. We called it "The Revolution Won't Be Twitterized," even though it's really not about Twitter. It's really about the future of what is coming next. What is that is desired? What is the evolutionary potential? Where is that we're going? And so my name is Fernanda. I'm the director of the Commons Engine. I've been playing in Holochain and Holo.host and with technology most of my life. Um, before social media was named social media, predicting what was possible and what's going to happen. And right now entering into that mysterious world where we're now accessing new layers with AI and other things that are coming our way. And with that, I'm going to pass the microphone to you, Sherry, my beautiful co-host, so that you can introduce yourself and then we'll go through context.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fernanda. It's so great to be here. Um, just for relevance today, I've been playing with the design stack of digital, social, and the deeper principles of nature as my guide for about 22 years since indiemedia.org was launched, which is where I met Evan, and who is also known as Rabble, and one of our panelists. And that launched citizen journalism worldwide. And so platforms have been in my life, and open source technology and have just been such a deep inquiry. And I would say that like the guidance I have is always around the biggest vision that's possible, and actually holding the North Star of what we are capable of as a species. And as Tyson Yunkaporta talks about, it's like that we are the guardian species on the planet. So I really take that to heart. And I'm always looking for the wisdom of nature and how that can guide us in terms of the role of conscious design in our technologies. And I have a media and organizational development background and a lot of facilitation and design. And I really am a co-creator at heart. And I believe in like the greatest future. You know, I'm a Star Trekkie. I'm like, okay, what do we really want to be here? Um, so I think technology is such a key piece of this, which is why I'm here, and all things collective. So I also believe in trim tabs and elegant interventions. And that's part of the motivation for us actually having this conversation here, to like insert a different quality of a conversation in.
So I'm going to reframe a little bit of the context of how the meeting happened, because that was a wonderful moment. I think that one of the aspects that is very prevalent with all this gossip and that is going around Twitter is those of us that are not looking at the gossip, because that is sure with some smile in our faces or intrigue or curiosity, but mostly for those of us that are curious about what the future can hold. What are the right patterns? What is the right social dynamics? What it would be possible for decentralized social media? What is the ebb and flow? What would need to be centralized? What decentralized? What level of permission? And like kind of having that as the lay ground for our discussion today. So I'm going to introduce briefly Arthur and Emaline. I think I'll do that together. You're raising us.
There,
Yeah.
maybe before you do that, I can also set a little context.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we haven't done that, just did an introduction.
Well, you did a little.
Yeah. So, and I think Scott, Stephen, can you mute? Are you muted? Someone's not muted. Yeah, thank you. So just adding to what Fernanda said about why we're here, I also want to invoke sort of the question about what's possible, because there's no doubt in my mind that we are a microcosm of the macrocosm of those people who are interested in that. We're actually in a civilization redesign process. And so the more we can become aware of this process around how we can become a thriving culture, the better our decisions can be. And we know that this conversation here is just part of a lot of other conversations, and it's just the beginning. So we're not going to like accomplish the deep dive, but we're seeding a field because we could spend days on this, and we do need to be in these inquiries. And it's really, I already named this about becoming a guardian species on the planet, but it is about stewarding the commons. And as Arthur kind of commented about, like the abuse of the commons, it's like, how are we stewarding our commons? So, and then also I would just say, how are we actually telling the story of who we are and how did we get here and what's possible now? And with what we know, where can we go? So that's the exciting moment that I feel that we're in. So thank you for being here for us.
Mm, mm. Very much so. So I'm not going to introduce and Art with like a long intro, but mostly a very human one. The three of us work together in Holo and launching Holo and launching the ICO, and we've been in this path for a while. And so we're friends, we're collaborators. Emaline and I were directors of the co-directors of the Commons Engine for a while. So for me, Emaline will always have a foot in Commons Engine and will be a peer in my field, in my world. And with Arthur is just family. We've been working together for about 2 decades, and I consider him not only one of the brightest humans I know, but also with one of the huge heart that constantly looks into what is good for the common good, and comes out with incredible ways and solutions so that we can have collaboration and scale, and we can meet the challenges of our time. And with Emaline, I did invite her today as well because she's a psychologist, and she's written about the topic of addiction and social media for a while. And she has her own tech company called Neighborhoods these days, which is also part of the Holochain ecosystem. So with that said, Sherry, if you want to bring, I did a mix. So
awesome. It's awesome. Yeah, so I will happily introduce just briefly Jenny Stefanotti. She's the founder and steward of Denizen. She also has a master's in economics and international development from Kennedy School, and she was a fellow at Stanford D School. So she has her chops in design. And she spent a lot of years doing strategy in the tech industry. So it's perfect that she's here, including Google for about 4 years, and a key time when they were going global. And I have been watching Jenny and participating with her in the Denizen community for the last couple of years, starting from Clubhouse to now this really empowered, engaged community. And it's been really inspiring. The way she's done it is just beautiful. And she really, really cares about everything that she puts out. She designs things well. So it's really an honor that, Jenny, you're here. And then Rabble, I think he's got Rabble up there. I've known him as Rabble, and Evan Henshaw-Plath. I've known him for 22 years, since we were both co-founding Indie Media back in 1999. And I consider him to be a really exemplar movement builder who is dedicated to making technology work for people and communities that can actually actualize true democracy. And he was there at the beginning of Twitter, and he has some amazing stories to share about some design choices. And he's not only an engineer, but he's also an entrepreneur, and he thinks about these big questions for as long as I've known him. And he's also the CEO of Planetary. So it's wonderful to have you here with us, Rabble, as well. Welcome to both of you.
Yeah. So now it's the opportunity for each of you panelists to introduce yourselves with a question about, tell us a bit about yourself in relationship to this topic, something that leads you up from the opportunity space. And with that, I would love to begin, if possible, with Emaline.
Sure. Hey, everyone. And thank you very much for having me. I'm glad to be here. So I'll echo a little bit of what Fern said about me, but basically, like I come to this world, and I've really only been a part of it for the last 5 years or so, from a research psychology background with an emphasis in qualitative methods. So I'm really interested in basically how people self-describe, how they tell their stories, how they frame their life worlds, that sort of thing. And I ended up doing a dissertation on internet addiction because, it really seemed to me that people like helping professions and people in human services really didn't quite understand the kind of the possibility space, like we mentioned here, the possibility space of the ways that people were forming networks and connecting and expressing themselves online. It seemed like the balance was really off, basically, between that on the one hand, and then the sort of pathological forms that life online takes. And so I consider myself kind of an activist among psychotherapists, kind of urging around the importance of like championing the expressive and the creative elements of what's possible online and in social groups online. Um, and really kind of holding that in tow, I would say, with some of the things that I think we're really all collectively noticing, even the psychic toll, right, that a Zoom bomber can kind of take on us and on our space. It's palpable. So yeah, I've been here for the last many years, kind of staying in inquiry about different economic and social principles that can kind of form the basis of the ways that we recreate the social web. I tend to work in communications and to some degree on the business development side of things here. Like Fern said, in Holo, in the Commons Engine, and then most recently in the Neighborhoods project. And neighborhoods is, this topic is so germane because neighborhoods is really all about giving communities tools to kind of open the black box of social media, as we say, and have a little bit of say and a little bit of knowledge about the algorithms that kind of create the choice architecture that they use on their platforms. So glad to be here, and I'll pass it off.
Mhm. Thank you so much. I love the mention of the choice architecture because it's really what we're designing, the architecture of choices that people have. Thank you. And next, if I think I'm gonna go with ladies first, probably then. So Jenny.
Some context on my background, as Sherry mentioned, I have this sort of heterogeneous background that includes working in the tech industry and studying economics and policy and doing design. But Denizen, the conversation that I've been curating for the last couple of years is really focused on this question of systems and acknowledging that there are very significant issues with the current systems and interrogating what new systems might look like. And so when we look at technology and specifically social media and specifically the current paradigms of social media, where there's market dynamics that lead to centralization and profound amount of power being concentrated in the decisions being made by people who have incentives that are very misaligned with what we care about from a social perspective. I'm very interested in how you break out of that paradigm. And so decentralized social media is an opportunity to do that. So I've just been asking some of those really deep questions about what are our social objectives? What are the human needs that lead us to engage in social media? And how might we design or really experiment with different kinds of platforms that yield those sorts of outcomes? And I recently did a conversation on decentralized social media with Rabble. So it's great to have him here and get to continue with some of these deeper questions where that conversation left off.
Wonderful, thank you. So that gives a good bridge into Rabble to answer this question.
Yeah, so I mean, we've been trying to figure out, like, throughout the history of humanity, we see new communications mediums rise up, and we try and figure out how to operate them. And for the last couple hundred years, they very consistently get enclosed by market economics. And sometimes we have regulations that stop them or keep them decentralized, but we've been seeing decades of consolidation in the media. And the advent of social media 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it felt like we were re-democratizing everything. And we created a space by which you didn't have to be a professional to create it. But we re-democratized participation, but we didn't democratize ownership of the platforms. And so what happened was you didn't have to be a journalist to get a voice. You didn't have to own a printing press to to produce your things, or a copier to make a zine. But the platforms grew this place where they had a tremendous amount of power, and it felt radically democratic and participatory. But then, as that power grew, the incentives behind it became opaque and became controlled, and eventually, Twitter itself didn't make enough money that it could fight off a very, Elon Musk being able to put together a financial package to buy the platform. And so now we're back into a situation where we said, okay, well, we democratized media once, but we didn't own the underlying control. We didn't own the means of communication in some way. We got the right to do it, but we didn't own it. And without the right to do it, without the sort of ownership, we don't get a say on the algorithms. We don't get a say on the structures. We don't get a say on what the governance rules are. And so what I've been doing with Planetary, but what all of these projects have been doing, is saying, okay, how do we build technologies and software and communities that return people to controlling their own spaces? How do we stop being the shopping mall? And so, Planetary uses the secure scuttlebutt protocol. There's a bunch of Holochain protocols. There's a bunch of other things that are out there. But okay, how do we build the underlying technology? And then what is the social implications of changing this power look like? And that is interesting, because before Elon Musk took over Twitter, every time we would talk about this, they'd be like, great, but you can never convince anyone to use it. Or great, but you can never convince anyone that the power behind, Twitter will be abused. Or the power, people will just go to TikTok and Instagram and Twitter because that's where the audience is. Now, we see that we lose a platform and all the rules get changed, and like basically the benevolent dictator becomes evil, and now people see why we need to not live in a dictatorship. So that's the exciting thing, actually, is now a larger world knows why we need these open systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we've been in this path before, right? Like even with the printing press, that sometimes they got decentralized and we thought it was decentralized. Knowledge is getting to more people, and then boom, it becomes centralized. So in some way, we've been in this kind of pendulum moving as society back and forth, back and forth. And what was very interesting for me when I joined social media was that I could be a creator, I could be a producer. And then so everybody's in and we believe into these ideals, but then capitalism comes and we're not changing the economics. So we get trapped into those economics. So Arthur, would you want to go into a little bit of you and your relationship to this topic?
Truthfully, I don't want to necessarily talk much about me. I'm interested in the opportunity that we're seeing, in that, yes, the transparency of kind of the abuse on the financial side of being able to kind of, it wasn't exactly a hostile takeover. In fact, he was asking to not take it over, but
which is the craziness of the markets.
Exactly. The dynamics, the feedback loops that drive this stuff always point it in deleterious directions eventually. Like how many great platforms have you seen get acquired and then go to crap? Like actually many. Makes me think of the Ning communities that many groups were using and things like that. But what I'm interested in is kind of like, not only is the opportunity pointing to the abuses of power, the centralized power and economics behind it, but also I think we're at a state where we can ask different questions about the dynamics of the social spaces themselves. It's like, okay, we have Facebook and Twitter and Tumblr and TikTok and different spaces that have different dynamics. What are the dynamics possible? What are the ones that we want? What are the feedback loops, the balances, the trade-offs? I feel like more people can engage in a better discourse about this at this point, such that we could steer in more interesting directions and use these kinds of opportunities, the disruptions that occur, as an opportunity to point people in directions with maybe more creative dynamics instead of just sort of like attention-getting dynamics. That's it for me for now.
Mhm. Sherry?
Yeah, I know that that was really great, and there's a lot of goodness there, and I really appreciate that people are kind of in the chat asking questions, and please continue to use that as a vehicle for engagement during this first section. I wanted to just perhaps a question to Rabble to kind of set a little bit of this scene, because we're talking about the choice points that we have with our technology, and that we've seen this cycle over and over again. And as Arthur just said, we're actually in a different place. We have different capacities. We are wiser in our choices. And so Arthur's saying, no, it's true. We don't want to say we're too wise, but we are wiser, and we could actually step into more of our wisdom with the kind of design choices that we're making on behalf of all humanity. And Rabble, there was in the interview, which I highly recommend with you and Jenny, there was this choice point that happened with Twitter that was back in the very early stage. And I think it just might be a kind of a cautionary tale. If you could quickly lead us through that, because I think that it kind of helps us go, what can we avoid going forward?
Sure. So anytime you design these platforms, you're making all sorts of small decisions that may or may not have large implications later. In Twitter's case, there was the decision of, is it a protocol? How does the API work? And there were a few critical points. One, you originally could interact with Twitter via chatbots using the Jabber XMPP protocol. And that gave you a few affordances. One, it let you use instant messaging clients to talk to Twitter. And that was the original reason it was built. But then the protocol let you federate the way Mastodon or the Fediverse works now. And so that feature became sort of an easy to build fallout. And there was at one point between Jaiku and Twitter, federated microblogging. And that got dropped basically because the technology behind it didn't quite scale and no one was the advocate for it. It wasn't like it decided, okay, well, we're not going to do this. This is a terrible idea, or we shouldn't be part of this open ecosystem. The board said, yes, let's do it as an open ecosystem. And then the cost of scaling it didn't work. The other tricky thing was Twitter in the early days, you would use your username and password and you would put it into any application and then it would interact with the Twitter servers. And that, at the time, felt dangerous to the users because the users were trusting these third-party app developers with their login credentials. But so OAuth, the way you log in with now everything, was created to solve that problem for Twitter originally, and then everybody else used it. By creating OAuth, it shifted the power to the platform that didn't exist there in the platform. And so these sort of subtle things, who has the keys, what are the protocols, is this an open protocol, how do I interact with it, can I move between systems, all of these subtle things ended up cementing the power that meant that when you're deplatformed from Twitter or when you're shadow banned, you don't have any visibility into it, and it doesn't operate as part of this open network. And so, but no one at the time quite knew how big the implication was, especially the OAuth thing. We didn't realize it would shift power to platforms from app developers.
Bravo.
Wow, there's a lot of places where to go. I think I want to go inside into the result, kind of the outcomes of the technology that we ended up with. Probably we could say that we built, but not like really consciously built, but that we kind of unraveled as part of all the dynamics, all the decisions, all the players. And I would want to go with the question about what happened then to our society. What happened? What was the shock to our collective system? What is happened that is probably irreversible in terms of our psychology, in terms of this narcissist society, in terms of the ways in which it has created anxiety, in which it has created those kind of patterns that are not exactly the social coherence, collaboration, and great moment for emergence that we were hoping for. And so Emaline, with your own experience about addiction and the writings that you've done, you've been doing such depth work with that. Will you be able to start with that one?
Sure. I mean, there are a couple different ways we could sort of take this. Like, for the most part in my writing, I used internet addiction as sort of like a to kind of corral a set of symptoms, which felt to me much more like collective or social symptoms than individual symptoms. And those were things that, interestingly, people seemed to kind of grasp a hold of without necessarily knowing where they came from, right? Which is kind of the definition of a symptom. So characteristic of addiction, right, is like, and this is removed from the way that the Psy industries tend to treat and handle drug addictions, right? Because really the big issue there is that, like, there was a grafting on of the notion of addiction from, like, unequivocally kind of harmful hijacking drugs to, like, a proliferation of behavioral symptoms, including, like, the use of the internet and the use of social communication technologies. The difference, of course, being that, we don't necessarily have, like, you can't call something an addiction that is like a being in society in the ways that society kind of expects you to participate, right? It really creates this choke point between the individual and the collective, where you really see like a blaming on the individual of, like, a collective operating infrastructure, essentially. So I think the biggest sort of facet here is like a lack of agency. And an ability to understand where that comes from, right? It's sort of like the feeling of being, and I love the way that this word kind of works across the psychological and the tech spectrum, which is the feeling of being a user, right? Like, essentially, and I think this really filters into the theory of change that I know a lot of us hold, is that you can't really you can't really expect individuals to change without really changing the sort of collective features and the technological affordances, that are given. And so so this lack of agency and a loss of control are really, like, the primary psychological symptoms of addiction. And so I think the question then becomes, well, how do you return this feeling of control or this feeling of agency in a social space? Right. And it turns out to not actually be permitting more and more freedom for saying or for giving opinions. Right. It's like we've kind of driven that notion to the hilt. Right. There's already, like, infinite opportunities to say what you want to say or to give your opinion on X, Y, and Z. Right. But what we haven't really seen is the possibility to give an opinion or to have a say in the way that social spaces are created and the way that they're governed, right? So it's almost as if, like, collectively we've been taking this chance on like a very innocent or a very naive notion of free speech, where free speech is just the freedom to say anything on your mind. And that has really conditioned, it's really become an imperative, I would say, for digital natives, people who are growing up on social media, is this sort of exhaustion in the face of having endless opportunities to share or to give. And it really leads to a sort of feeling of, from the people I've interviewed and spoken to, it really leads to a feeling of overexposure and anxiety in the face of not knowing. Right. So you get this sort of vicious cycle where the more opportunities there are to, to engage or to speak your piece or to kind of air whatever is like in these deep corners of yourself that like you'd often decide not to say, the more you do that, the more insecure you feel in your knowledge and in your understanding of the world and in your ability to sort of discern. So this is kind of like the big, this is kind of like the psychological background of the sort of overexposure and the exhaustion of being invited to speak and to give and to share, but sort of like on the wrong level, right? And so I think what we're maybe examining together here today is like, what happens when we stop opining at the content level and start expressing on the, the social space infrastructure level.
That's really a great kind of overview. Thank you so much, Emaline. Really powerful. And you seeded a lot in the field for us. And I want to pass the next question, building on that to Jenny. And I think about all the, about how are we taking the possibility of governing our systems when we've been like kind of locked out, we haven't been actually participating. And you've done so much with really bringing forward the commons and stewardship and the work of Eleanor Ostrom and Donella Meadows. And I think about this question of like, what then is the obligation of a social, and is there an obligation, of course, of a social media platform to the greater good? Like how would you articulate that?
I think that, so for me, all of this is boiling down to like, what are the incentives of the architects of these platforms? And so that brings me to questions of how are things funded? So Fernanda, to your question, and how are they funded? What are the incentives that come into place as a consequence of how they're funded? And how are they governed? And so there's a wide opportunity space in terms of what that might look like, but absent structures that like really align social objectives with decision making, there's a fundamental tension in place. Fernanda, to your question, how did we get here? We got here because the fundamental market dynamics of a social media platform yield a couple of players due to network effects. And then they're optimizing for engagement because they make their money on, I'm sure everyone here is well aware of these dynamics, right? It turns out it would make sense that what you engage on is an indication of what you're interested in. If you're engaging, it's serving some need, but it turns out there's all sort of, to Emeline's point around like, what is the psychology? There's all kinds of cognitive biases that come into play when it comes to engagement on social media. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with Tristan Harris's work, where now we have, these enormously resourced, powerful companies, who have the most sophisticated AI in the world, developing algorithms that, we aren't even aware of the extent to which we are being manipulated in engagement. So for me, the question boils down to, how is the entity governed? There are all kinds of questions, and Rob and I talked about like, what are the big open questions and debates in the decentralized? So there's all kinds of questions around how a space might be governed. And I think it's really imperative that, well, one, we understand that there's subjectivity in the answers to those questions. And so a healthy ecosystem around social media would yield a heterogeneity of spaces that are governed in different ways so that people can choose to participate in platforms that are aligned with their beliefs. And also a overarching architecture that doesn't have, these network effects. Such that you don't have the emergence of just a couple of players. So what's interesting about the social media space is that, you still have, islands associated with protocols, but you have a heterogeneity of platforms that sit on top of those protocols. So there's more scope for choice. But when you have more players, you can get some of these more creative governance structures. But again, I always go back to how is the entity funded? and how is the entity governed? Because in most spaces, for-profit entities just have a fundamental tension in place between how they're going to return capital to their investors and whatever those social objectives are.
You're muted, Fernanda.
Thank you so much. Good to be reminded. So this is a beautiful bridge to going deeper into what we call in our work the social physics. What are the dynamics? What are the at play? What are the different dimensions, the different participations, the filters, the privacy, the membranes that we need to be setting if we want a truly decentralized social networks that can create social coherence, can create harmony, can help us really enact that potential, that evolutionary potential that we know we need to be able to leap forward into beautiful world our hearts knows is possible. And I would like to start with you, Arthur.
Yeah, as you know, since we talked about it earlier this week, I've been thinking a lot about some of these dynamics and some of the gradients and tensions that are involved with some of the choices that you make. And I mean, for me, one of the places I started thinking about this was just the signal to noise ratio and what decisions you make, because people won't stay in a space if there isn't enough valuable signal, if it's all just spam and noise and advertisements and, and so there's a tension there that you have to manage in order to actually engage people and keep them. And there's choices that we make, like in terms of how global something is. Like one of the metaphors that's been being used by Twitter from its CEOs, 3 different CEOs have used this phrase now about a global town square kind of thing. So the idea there is universal reach versus private spaces. In private spaces, it's much easier to create coherence and much easier to have high signal and less noise. Permissive content versus moderated, anonymous sources versus some kind of provenance about knowing where things come from. There's tensions along these gradients, but there's other dynamics that aren't even just about signal to noise. There's like things like, is your participation, do you have permanent license or can you be ejected? And all the things around that. Is interaction direct, peer-to-peer, or is it intermediated by middlemen of some sort? Do you even have global address spaces, or is it like only selective feed activity that isn't even globally addressable? I mean, there's a lot of different things here that lead to different kind of dynamics depending on where you set those settings. I've got about 20 more of those kind of gradients. And I know I'm biased in Holochain that what we want to do is create spaces that support social coherence. And so it makes me think of, is a Twitter alternative available by having an easy DNA people can plug into their other apps? I'm using some Holochain jargon here. And a microblogging DNA that people can kind of attach on to their other apps. And then when participants in that community actually make microblog entries, they could choose whether or not they want them to be able to be syndicated to a more global space. And you could actually have different membranes of privacy. You could have completely private messages. You could have ones that are just to this community and they don't bleed out. But then you could have a bridging DNA that you could attach, that you could have sort of syndicate these things, and you get a little bit of that federated kind of effect of Mastodon, but you also have coherence and purpose in different spaces. And each message you can actually just choose whether or not, and you can set defaults. Obviously, you don't necessarily have to make it more work to be having the default be that you want to go public or whatever. But it just, when you talk about concerns about hate speech and stuff, it's like some people were building a plugin for Mastodon for global search by content, because right now you can only search by hashtag and username and a couple of other like defined variables. You can't search on general content, and they kind of quashed the effort because they looked at it as a way to target people with hate speech who were writing about particular things if you could search them. And to me, that points to just not having the membranes set up correctly, which I think I'm just going to spill over a little bit into one of the questions I think Brad was asking about Mastodon. Like, I think Mastodon, if it continues to grow and take hold, the whole Fediverse kind of thing is going to have the same kind of problems that we have with email, that we have to deal with spam and spam filtering. And because if I just mention you, then my stuff shows up, my thing shows up in your inbox, which allows for spamming in the Fediverse structure. So we're going to end up with similar kinds of tensions that have made email, which was once a really simple thing to set up your own email server and manage it, is now a pain in the butt because of spam filtering and keeping your server off of spam lists and all kinds of stuff. It was a really easy democratic protocol, and now it's hard to run. I feel like Mastodon is going to end up having a similar trajectory unless they define more membranes, more sort of domains of social coherence. Anyway, that's how it looks to me. I see a lot of different possibilities, and I'm playing with a Twitter variant right now that we are building on Holochain. But I'm wondering what the best way to deploy that is. Is it as one big global thing, or is it more like the syndication from various community-based parts?
That's a great question, Arthur. And I'm just thinking, and I have some other questions that we could ask, but I would love to see if any of the other panelists, Jenny or Rabel or Emaline, you want to jump in on what Arthur just shared, and kind of build on that or respond to that in any way. I want to give you space for that.
I think that the idea that we should all be in one space and there should be one flat public sphere where everybody's communicating is part of what causes the problem. Like, I think that, and so Mastodon has this tension where you want to be able to discover people and connect to people and have this discussion, but you also, you don't want to make it vulnerable. It's I use an ecosystem metaphor where, if geography doesn't matter, then all of a sudden the most invasive plants will come in because they can jump from one place to the other, and we get a monoculture, which is super vulnerable and then leads to collapse. And so one of the reasons that Twitter can be toxic and other like centralized platforms is because they have economic incentives to make it really big and make you really connected and everything else. But then that leads to vulnerability of monocultures. Whereas at least what we're doing with Planetary and the Secure Scuttlebutt protocol, and I believe a lot of the Holochain projects as well, is saying actually there are these scoped communities, and there's this sort of commons model of these are these limits, they have overlapping commons, but you can know where you are, and then you can set the rules for this space, define who is a member of this space, observe their behavior in this space, sanction them, set rules for the space, sanction people who violate the rules, and then enforce those. And I think if we either have the best mall cops in the world, which are the centralized platform trust and safety teams, and we're dependent on what they say, and all of a sudden one group can take over running the platform and say hate speech is okay, we're going to add everybody back, or we build smaller sets of spaces that are governed as a commons, or we do the Chinese model, which is just the government decides what speeches behave acceptable on social media, and they have millions of people who enforce it. But the models that we see emerging are this commons model where you have more constrained spaces where you have understandings of limits and you can provide local governance of that. And to me, that's super exciting because that then gives us space for economic models to exist inside those commons that aren't aren't unified and don't have to scale up to billions, hundreds of billions of dollars.
Really great stuff, Rabel. And I want to just open it up to either, because we're getting into some juice here. And if you could just speak really quickly, Rabel, about the algorithm question, because I think that's like such an interesting piece of this puzzle, is the algorithms that we don't see. And I have this feeling sometimes when often when I'm on these platforms, I'm like, I do not like that algorithm. I can feel it. Your algorithm is not a syntropic algorithm. It is like doing harm in the field. So maybe just quickly share that so that then we can let either Jenny or Emaline chime in.
The algorithms are fascinating. So, like, one, people have this idea that somehow you could live without an algorithm. Reverse chronological order is an algorithm. Everything that software does are algorithms. And the question is not, do we not have an algorithm? It goes back to many, many years ago, Sherry, when we were doing indie media, people were like, I don't want an algorithm that decides who does what and what the most important news is. And that itself is an algorithm which says we prioritize who's done the most recent post. So what we need is to look at all the research into algorithmic transparency and user agency. And there's tons of academic research on this stuff of some of these algorithms are fairly simple, but a lot of them are driven by, real-time feedback and machine learning and complicated stuff like that. And so what you need to do is you need to say, users can have many different algorithms. If everybody's centralized on one algorithm, and this is the problem with Google search results and this problem with Instagram and Twitter, is they've got an algorithm that they try and use, then there's tremendous economic incentive to game that algorithm. Because if you can, you can go viral and you get millions of followers or you get millions of visitors on your website and you make a lot of money from it. So one is don't have a single algorithm that you can take over, and then make other space for many different algorithms and give users agency over those algorithms, and then provide an engagement so that they can see what am I optimizing for. But opting out of the idea of how the algorithm doesn't work. In Planetary, we optimize for a certain kind of engagement. But we don't optimize for just the newest thing. We do something where we make it so that older conversations can get brought back up and elaborated on. So sometimes I see conversations from 6 years ago in there where people continue to elaborate and add on stuff and continue to connect it and reconnect different messages. And so it doesn't have to be the immediacy. Now there's some super valuable things in Twitter's immediacy.
Rabel, I'm just for the sake of time. Oh my God, I could just hear you go. I would love to hear that go on more and more, and it will be continued. But let's build on that, because you laid down a couple of key pieces from either Jenny or Emaline.
Yeah, I mean, I can add to that. I mean, for me, there are just some fundamental questions that we need to be holding while we're having this conversation. Like, first and foremost, like, what is the social objective of these platforms? And we can delineate several of them and why they're important. And I think once we have that, we can ask questions about the cost and benefits of those platforms being at various scales. Because at a global scale, you're still only able to, there are limits to how much information a human can consume. It needs to be intermediated by an algorithm. So I think there are questions about the social objectives and the scale implications that are really important. Related to that, there's a question of what are the human needs that these are solving, right? That these are addressing, that then lead people to engage with these platforms, which is different, right? And if we are architects and designers with a desire to yield certain social outcomes, we need to hold both of those questions and understand how we can build technology that aligns them. But to my prior point, like this third question of what are the incentives of the architects of these technologies, because they are very much often not in a place that allows them to draw a through line between the human needs that lead us to engage in these platforms and the social outcomes that we care about. I mean, another thing that I will add that I think introduces a very significant complexity to addressing the challenges that we're talking about is the fact that there are a lot of cognitive biases at play that lead to the way that people engage with these platforms, and as a consequence, the social outcomes of that. And so, as an architect of the system and the technology, one has to be aware of those biases in order to design tech that yields the social outcomes that we care about. And that introduces something very complex with respect to paternalism, because there's some judgment that those architects need to make around what's best for society. So I'm going to sort of induce certain types of behaviors. And so I just think it's very interesting to think about governance, holding that complexity at hand.
I'm very curious about your take on this, Emaline, as I know that neighborhoods focuses a lot on governance, and it focuses on kind of a language, a pattern language for decision making. It kind of like doesn't give a one recipe, but it wants people to create their own recipes, their own spaces. And so what is the challenges that, or the big questions that are rising for you in the design space?
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of go back a little bit, like I think there's some, if there's any consensus in the space, it's sort of around this idea that like there needs to be some sort of a breaking down or a balkanizing of these massive flat public spaces. Like I just kind of can't agree more with what Rabel was saying, basically about the fact that things get that large and that flat, and there's like a fear on the side of platform creators for any limitations whatsoever, basically because it's at odds with the corporate model, right? And with the network effects that make it possible to, to attract advertisers. And so really, I think it's mostly about how, and like a lot of what we've been looking into at neighborhoods, even though we're in this very early stage right now, really kind of surrounds like the complexity involved with naming the intention of a space, and kind of encouraging people to create like a community around a particular project or a social goal that they have, and really hold that as a North Star. And basically what we are asking again and again is exactly like, how can we create the technical affordances that will enable the holding of a specific purpose, and how can we avoid the sorts of, like, ultimately, I think it's desperation that makes people want to compromise on the intentions that they've set for a space. Is a feeling that they have to kind of either grow or die, or that, if the platform isn't about everyone, with all of, it's kind of like how the one size fits all approach never really works. But I think there are a lot of economic and other incentives that make people want to continue reverting to a sort of one size fits all space that we've just seen isn't possible. And to Jenny's point about the cognitive biases available too, like I think it's fair to note that a lot of people who are interested in redesigning these spaces have their own biases, and I won't weigh in on these, but their own biases toward the importance of like a balanced perspective, and the importance of diversity, and the importance of, like kind of hearing all sides. And that's, in a lot of ways, that's the sort of attitude that creates the political dynamic in the US, right? Because like the left and liberals think that it's really important to balance and hear all sides, whereas it's really easy for the conservative right to sort of just screen out all opinion, or to devalue comparatively, the opinions that they don't hold themselves. And so kind of looking at the dynamics that play out between people who are, like, why it's the case that it's hard for us to hold a particular intention for a space, and why it's hard to say, even though like we value this, even though it's not the intention of the space, right? To kind of open up a gray realm rather than have like an either or sort of perspective. So looking at the trappings of why it's so hard to hold to a particular mission, and why it's so difficult to say, hey, I mean, that's awesome, but that's not our space. You are muted, Fern.
To determine the intention of the space without determining the space, but still say in this space, this is what we value. I would love to open to Q&A, but before that, I'm going to ask each panelist in about like 2 minutes each, something that is really from the conversation and your own sensing on where it is at. What is some remarks, something that you would like to seed the space with before we go to Q&A? And I will start with Arthur as we've been hearing the other voices.
I mean, what shows up for me is, again, some of the design principles we've chosen for Holochain in terms of like agent centricity, the ability for people to be in the driver's seat, to set their own boundaries, filters, algorithms, feed priorities, that type of thing. That feels like one of the things that dissolves some of the power dynamics is if you can opt into your own selection criteria and it's not being handed to you by somebody prioritizing advertisers. And Jenny was bringing up the issue of the money, the economics of the infrastructure. But if you look at Scuttlebutt or Holochain, it's like those are self-hosted by peers. These are peer-to-peer technologies. You don't have to pay for big data centers and server farms, and there's still software development costs, but they're also open source projects. And I think you could end up with a scenario where people are contributing new feed algorithms, new feed sort algorithms, and new skins for having the thing look the way that you want. And, you could really have a vibrant ecosystem where, yes, it's going to take some initial development to create a center of gravity for that ecosystem, but it won't necessarily take a high amount of income to operate it. And I think that there's a handful of business models that actually are pretty lightweight that make that easy. I mean, one of the ones that we're looking at, that we're playing with for a Twitter-like thing on Holochain is just registering your name. That if you don't pay for a name, then you're treated sort of like a Wikipedia disambiguation page. There could be 6 or 7 different users named Kitty Cat, and then you have to, if you want to search by user, you have to choose them from this list, and you don't actually just get exclusive control of your username unless you register that name. And then anyway, just an example of something that might produce plenty of revenue to actually operate something like that if you don't have all the centralized infrastructure. So I'm interested not only in the kind of difference in the social physics, but also the differences in the economics when we really make this a distributed platform.
Great, you're still unmuted, Fair.
Fair, you're muted.
Keep on muting. Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Arthur. So let's keep going into the last remarks. And Jenny, would you go next?
Sure, I'm happy to. I mean, I think that what this conversation underscores is just the need to have an overarching ecosystem that allows for many different players to be able to hold a very significant diversity of views around speech and content moderation and what the code of conduct and what the culture looks like versus what we have now, which is just a couple of players with, to my point, misaligned incentives dictating those sorts of things. And so, what gets me excited about decentralized social media is that it does allow, to Arthur's point, the vast majority of the dominant protocols are open source. Right? They have very different structures than we're used to thinking about in terms of private venture capital funded technology, which creates better incentives fundamentally in the market. But I think looking towards supporting the emergence of a healthy ecosystem with a lot of diversity, where people are able to freely switch between and opt into platforms that align with those specific set of preferences. And to your point at the top of the conversation, Sherry, like, how do we think about architecting something that mimics nature? Right? In nature, you have this diversity, you have different types of experimentation, and I think also really critically, you think about the sort of fractal nature of social media and having platforms that show that kind of architecture as well.
I love that polyculture approach. Then people can be able to identify what is the kind of spaces that most benefit whatever outcomes they have, because we're multidimensional beings. So probably one space won't fit at all. We need like different types of relationship, different types of mode of interaction. So that's brilliant. Thank you, Jenny. Rabo?
Yeah, I think that the multi-spaces thing is very important. In our case with Planetary, we're part of a community of people who build the secure scuttlebutt protocol, and there are multiple distinct implementations of it. So you can run scuttlebutt in Kotlin or JavaScript or Elixir or Go, and each of those implementations isn't dependent on each other. And so if Planetary disappeared, you would still, like, the scuttlebutt ecosystem doesn't disappear. And so, but it's also important that it's easy to build applications on top of it. Like, because these things are complicated, open source works because we build all these components on top of each other. And so one of the things we see is scuttlebutt happening is people come in and they build their own scuttlebutt application for themselves. And that's like a really common thing, that lots of people build their own applications that do their own thing, and it's on top of the common set of tools. But if we're talking about autonomy, it's like, okay, how do we move the user from one application to another? How do if I don't like what Planetary is doing, how do I go to Miniverse? That works within the scuttlebutt ecosystem, but it doesn't tell us how do we bridge between ecosystems. Like, do this, what if the people I'm talking to are using neighborhoods and Holochain? How do we bridge that? What do people bridge between the Fediverse, which is this fundamentally server focused thing, and these more peer-to-peer protocols? And what are the accountability of it? There's my friend Blaine Cook wrote a statement called the Slocum statement. I'll drop the link in just a second. Basically, it's a declaration of accountability for these new social media providers, whether or not they're a Fediverse node or someone providing a peer-to-peer application. It's like, what rights do you provide to the user? What obligations do you have to them? And it's the equivalent of being, certified organic or certified B Corp. It's like, we need a way in which we can judge these providers, all the applications in the space or all the different hosts, and say, okay, these are how I hold accountability, and it gives the user the ability to understand that and move between them. And it's a much messier ecosystem than what we had with a few big companies. But I actually think it'll be more innovative because we're not waiting for permission.
Mm-hmm. Emaline, your last remarks?
Oh, I kind of thought I made my last remarks, but I'm just, I'm just grateful for the way that this conversation is unfolding, and also really grateful that there seems to be, something gelling around, like I'm seeing here in the chat, consciousness of change, how and why that's emerging, like the way that, and seeing like a really great proficiency, I would say, like among this group in the way that technical affordances are, necessary but not sufficient for the way that we recreate the social web, essentially. And I'm just really interested in hearing more in following up with everyone here about what exactly that consciousness of change is, and what it really means to each one of us individually. How we intend to bring this consciousness of change into newer versions of the social web, what that has to do with governance, and what that has to do with the rights and obligations of creators and of stewards of infrastructure. So, just thanks.
So we have different types of questions from before. There's one for you, Evan, around how is planetary social thinking about the idea of funding in order to have people being able to govern and choose the rules of their spaces over time?
So funding is hard. There's lots of ways to get funding. Planetary is a public benefit corporation, but it means we're a corporation and we need funding for it. Secure Scuttlebutt is a network of organizations and people that is mostly funded from a few investors into different projects and European Union funding and donations on Open Collective. The things that have value, we're calling these room servers, which users can set up, and that's where your identity next, and that's where you can connect to people. And so anybody can set up and run their own room servers. And Planetary runs a bunch of them, but other people do as well. But yeah, we're dependent on having a sustainable business model. We need to be able to build things that have services, just like Arthur talked about, like having a name service. Like we're working with folks of saying, okay, you can have scoped names, you can have pet names, but if you want to have a root name, it's something that maybe you do register and buy. It's fascinating that we came to similar models by that. It's open source, you have autonomy to build it, but if we don't have fund the developers, it dies. And so we need to build systems by which users can fund things. And they either fund it because they can run ads and click on ads, or they fund it because they can send up payments and buy things, whether that's names, or they can provide funding to the platform in some kind of badge system or subscription system that works. I would really like us to figure out a way for the funding to not just fund the platform, but if you're using a room that is doing moderation work and collaborative work and deciding sort of community building, you provide funds that pay the people doing that community organizing work in addition to the platform. Some sort of system by doing what the current experiment in our ecosystem is something called a local coin, which is not a cryptocurrency, but it's sort of adjacent to it. It's like a punch card. So anyone can create a punch card, like a cafe creates a punch card. I could buy 5 coffees and get 5 punches. Sherry could buy 5 coffees, and I could take the 2 punch cards together and exchange them for a cup of coffee. It's sort of the Ithaca dollar local currency equivalent that exists on the platform. And if we can do that and build a space by which it goes on, maybe we can build an economic model that is local controlled. But honestly, we haven't figured out the exact funding model. We've just gotten enough money to keep working on it. And I agree, it's super important. And we should be asking everybody what their funding model is.
Okay. Wow, that was great. Fer, do you want to go? Did you have a question?
You wanted to go. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we've got 13 more minutes. This has been so good. And you can feel how there's so much more that we could all be in dialogue about. We need platforms where we can have these kinds of conversations and track them and harvest them. And so a question, I want to just have each of you panelists to be, if you've been tracking questions, is there one that's like jumping up for you and that you would like to respond to that feels like it could really add value? And before we do that, I have a question about scaling. So in your tweet, Arthur, when you were kind of putting this out into the Twitterverse, you were talking about and how we can scale this. And so it's like such an interesting question when we have these kind of smaller communities, and we have sort of this autonomy in this community level, but then we can't actually know like what's happening in the larger space, and then how are we as a living system moving to be an ecosystem of aligned, organization. So that's like a design question that I have, and I'm wondering, maybe Arthur, that was on your tweet, do you want to respond, or does anyone else want to then add to that?
Sure. I mean, my interest is usually operating on multiple scales, including large scale. And because our tool has the word chain in it, we're often compared to blockchain, which has some serious scalability problems because they're trying to manage single state global consensus across a large space. And that inherently is going to be slow and take computation, no matter how many transactions per second some platform claims that they do. That's going to be doing very simple math type stuff. If you want to start building sophisticated apps that have state management, and you're going to try to manage it globally across every node, and you want to have it scale to the billions of users that Facebook has, or hundreds of millions of users that Twitter has, or whatever, those are not compatible approaches. Holochain just isn't managing global consensus, neither is Scuttlebutt, that's just not their approach. So we don't have some of those same constraints. The truth is, we've not been able to test Holochain at scales more than like 10,000 nodes or so, because we the test orchestration tools bog down, and there's not really good test orchestration tools for testing at larger scales than that yet. So we don't actually know what the limits of Holochain are. We have to build more fractal test orchestration tools to be able to test larger. Yeah, but the thing is that again, it's part of those trade-offs. There's always these gradients. If you want to try to create deterministic global state versus agent-centric autonomy that you can have global address spaces for, so you can look up things and find them, discover them. Those are just two different approaches, and one scales and one doesn't, but it's better for things that you want short-term deterministic things on smaller scales.
Thank you, Arthur. That's helpful. We could go deeper into this, and I'm just thinking that Jenny, I'd love to pass the baton to you. And if there's like a question that you have, or would you like to actually engage with that question? Because I know that you think about that in terms of from your certain lenses, but.
Well, I think that a really important part of this that I've seen a lot come up in the chat, but we haven't surfaced in the conversation, is just this question about speech, and how speech should be governed. And, I think there's often a misunderstanding that like the First Amendment applies to government regulating speech and constraining speech, not these platforms. And these platforms are considered private spaces who can be governed by the whims of the people who control them. And speech, it's also really important to understand that even with respect to the First Amendment, there is a distinction between political speech and commercial speech and speech that causes harm. So speech is regulated when it is caused harm by the government. And in fact, the platforms are legally obliged to take down that sort of content. And also a lot of the, I think a really interesting consideration in the speech conversation, a question to hold, is because there wasn't the ability for speech to propagate at the scale that can happen on these sorts of platforms. So a distinction between a right around voice and the propagation of voice is an interesting thing that has come up in these conversations as well. And, in many cases, the quote unquote speech or content that would be moderated is actually not even coming from a human, right? There are bots that are creating this. And so, thinking about speech in the contents of an era of AI where these platforms can be weaponized, I think, generates a very different and complicated conversation. And I just think it's important for those of us who care about this topic to just have some basic literacy in understanding speech and how speech is governed and the distinction between public and private spaces and what role these platforms play when they become our effective public squares. And so I feel like speech is such an essential, and I'll make one last point. I really think it's an extraordinary complicated thing that these platforms are forced to do, which is moderate content when there are these profound social consequences for the ways in which that is done. I think Facebook has done some pretty interesting things with their, outsourcing certain questions that are completely separate from the company that, don't have financial incentives with their, oh my God, I'm spacing on the name of it, but they have a body that does that. So I think that some of those sort of interesting governance structures are compelling and worth more deeply considering. But in my opinion, I think that the platforms and Mark Zuckerberg, for example, just kind of throwing up his hands and saying like, speech is really important, and I'm going to just allow, like being a little bit more lax in terms of content moderation. I think that's just sort of avoiding, engaging in a much harder problem.
Oh, we're coming to an end, and this has been fascinating. We have a big challenges ahead. We have all the governance conversations. We have all the ways about speech and public and private. We have the coming of the algorithms. We have of course, the part of the bots that comes with the algorithm and the, negative consequences of that. But, then the conversations about what is impact that is positive that could be as well from AI that we haven't entered into. So there's so many ways in which we can go, and we're finishing up. I think that I would like to have if possible, from everybody, like a little reaction. Like if you are so ready to migrate from Twitter, if we can just like do a thumbs up through the reactions, just to get like a collective like sense making of this space, like you can do it with your thumb, or you can do it like this with one of the emoticons, and just like have like, are you ready to migrate from Twitter? Like done. I'm looking consistently right now, looking into what moving out, and I'm looking for alternatives. So not a lot of people, not half of who we are, or we're not playing the game and doing the thumbs up.
The thumbs fade away, and you talked long enough that they faded.
Okay. So it's difficult to count. It would be great that they put like a little dashboard so we know, right? Or a little poll where we can have this sense making. Thank you everyone for coming today. Thank you for all our panelists. At Commons Engine, we like taking some of these kind of up balls, I would call it, up in the air, and then creating some conversation around it. We hope to be coming with other panels. We had one on the evolution of governance and DAOs, and we have one, this one around Twitter, and there probably will be others. Thank you so much, and have a good journey.
Oh, can I just say something before we go?
Thank you.
Yeah, just want you guys all to know, everyone who did register, because there's a bunch of people, there was like 80 people registered. So everyone will get a recording, and you're going to get that chat so that you can deepen and go back through that, because we've generated a wealth, and there was a vibrant dialogue. So I just really want to appreciate everybody in the chat channel.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate all of you.